Welcome to episode 4 of Everything History for the conclusion of the American Revolution.
I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
We left off shortly after Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. Picking up where we left off, the Second Continental Congress came into session on May 10th to decide a course of action, and this time all 13 colonies had delegates in Congress. Little could be done, though, because all eyes were on the Patriot siege of Boston. At the very beginning of the war, everything was uncertain. How much resistance could the Americans truly put up? Could they field a substantial military force? How long could the conflict last? In hindsight, we know all of these answers, but as the summer of 1775 began, everything was at risk for the colonies because if the approaching reinforcements under Sir William Howe routed the rebels at Boston, the Patriot cause would be finished. Britain was searching for just that knockout blow, too, as the Royal Navy came into Boston Harbor in June of 1775. The Patriots had somewhere between 10 to 15,000 armed combatants around Boston, but had absolutely no naval forces. The impending battle in Boston spurred Congress to action. They knew their army needed leadership, so they chose Colonel George Washington, veteran of the 7 Years' War, as commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army. I can only imagine how Washington felt as he left Philadelphia on his way to New England. He had just accepted the position that would lead civil war against the country he had once fought for. He wrote to his wife Martha stating, "I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid this appointment, but it has been some kind of destiny that has me upon this service." Before Washington arrived, though, the British launched an attack. On June 17th, General Howe landed troops on the Charlestown Peninsula across the water from Boston. The American militia responded and took up defenses on the hills of the peninsula. The hills were named Bunker and Breed's Hills, and thus began the Battle of Bunker Hill. Howe elected for a frontal attack on the Patriot fortifications, and it seems he expected little resistance. General Howe was sorely mistaken, though, and the Americans tore into the British lines despite their lack of training. The phrase of the battle for the Americans was, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Most of the fighting took place on Breed's Hill during the battle, and the Americans withstood 2 British assaults before the Patriots finally relented during the third attack. Britain won the Battle of Bunker Hill by means of a Pyrrhic victory. In other words, an extremely costly victory. The English suffered over 1,000 casualties, over double that of the Patriots, and Boston continued to be besieged despite the taking of Charlestown Peninsula. The Battle of Bunker Hill was a decisive moment in the early war period. The British were shocked. General Gage, who was there in Boston at the time, wrote back to Parliament saying, quote, "These people show a spirit and conduct against us they never showed against the French. They are spirited by a rage and enthusiasm as great as ever, and you must proceed in earnest or give the business up. A small body will not avail. You must have large armies. The loss we have sustained here is greater than we can bear." Soon after, Gage was replaced as commander-in-chief by William Howe. The English would not launch another attack from Boston for the rest of the siege. On July 3rd, Washington assumed command of the Continental Army outside of Boston. Aside from maintaining the siege, Washington had 2 priorities within a day of seeing exactly what he was leading. Priority 1, his army needed supplies. His army was in desperate need of food, water, clothing, gunpowder, and cannon. Luckily it was summer, but the lack of clothing will become a major concern soon for the Americans. Priority 2, discipline. Washington demanded that his army, from the officers to militiamen, needed to be intensely disciplined. He stressed discipline throughout the war as the one merit that could save his forces. He noted that a failure of discipline would produce, quote, "extreme hazard, disorder, confusion, and disappointment and disgrace." Dispatches were sent throughout the colonies for support, and Washington also began seeking assistance from France. Always eager to hurt England, France began shipping mass amounts of gunpowder to North America. The siege continued in New England with very little conflict for the rest of 1775, yet 2 more theaters of war began cropping up, the Canadian Theater and the Southern Theater of War. If you recall from the end of last episode, the Green Mountain Boys under Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had captured Fort Ticonderoga in upper New York. This was a key acquisition because from Fort Ticonderoga the Patriots could seal off Lake Champlain and thereby prevent British intervention into the southern Hudson River Valley. The reason the Hudson River waterway is so important is because it was by far the easiest, fastest, and most efficient method of transportation from Quebec down into America. Congress saw the benefits of an invasion into Canada because if Benedict Arnold and others could take the province of Quebec out of the war, it would give General Washington far more maneuverability and eliminate the threat of northern invasion. Something also overlooked by many today is that many in Congress believed that if Quebec could be liberated from Great Britain, that it would join their cause. Time was of the essence for the Quebec Campaign because winter was approaching fast. Two forces were assembled by the fall of 1775, one led by General Montgomery and another by Colonel Arnold. The campaign started off well for the Americans when Montgomery captured both Fort St. Jean and Montreal in early November. When Arnold pushed towards Quebec City, though, the campaign fell apart due to a lack of supplies and a massive winter. A wounded and depleted American force arrived in late December outside Quebec City, but they were quickly routed. Several battles ensued over the following months as Arnold began retreating in the spring of 1776. The British now went on the offensive, driving what was left of the Americans back to Fort Ticonderoga. The only good the campaign truly did was delay a British offensive from Canada until 1777, switching from the American disaster in the Northern Canadian front to the Southern theater back in September of 1775. As Washington continued in Boston and as Arnold conducted the excursions into British Canada, South Carolina was primed to explode. As autumn approached, Patriot and Loyalist tensions rose to violence. In September, Patriots forced the royal governor to flee from the colonial capital of Charleston and captured Fort Johnson that overlooked Charleston. Patriots and Loyalists clashed in the Carolina backcountry in mid-November 1775 that resulted in hundreds of casualties. One Colonel Richardson then marched a Patriot militia force out of Charleston in a campaign against Loyalists. The campaign led the Patriots towards the Appalachian Mountains, and by the time resistance was met, Richardson had a force of some 4,000 Patriots. In late December, several Loyalist camps were discovered and surrounded. The Patriots actually showed surprising discipline by forcing a surrender with only single-digit casualties. Hundreds of Loyalists were taken as prisoners, and with a strong message sent, the Patriot militia dispersed back towards Charleston. The result of the Southern Theater campaigns in late 75, early 76 was the crushing of the Loyalists, and the Patriots now had control over the South without contest. And after a failed British attempt to retake Charleston in June 76, the British were essentially expelled from the South until 1778. In Boston, the gridlock of siege warfare continued until General Washington received artillery cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. The Patriots installed the cannons on Dorchester Heights and prepared to bombard Howe's force. On seeing this, the British finally decided to flee Boston on March 17, 1776, as General Howe sailed his force to safety in Halifax, Nova Scotia. With the siege of Boston lifted, the Continental Army did not tarry for long. They set off for New York City because Washington feared a powerful British offensive on the city. Back in Great Britain, King George and Parliament were scrambling in early 76 to recruit for the rebellion in America. Despite widespread recruiting throughout the British Isles, King George had to resort to paying German mercenaries called Hessians to fill the enlistments. Finally, though, in late spring, the English sent a massive force of 32,000 soldiers to reinforce General Howe. With his bolstered force, Howe set his sights on stripping New York City from Washington. And at this point in time, New York City was only about 20,000 in civilian population and rested solely on the tip of Manhattan Island. Before we cover the battles for New York, though, there are many other developments that occurred most famously during the summer of 1776. After Washington forced Howe to evacuate Boston in March and regroup in Nova Scotia, all 13 colonies were then governed by Patriots. Free from royal officials and British attacks, the Americans began to seriously consider a move for independence. In January of 1776, Thomas Paine had published his very famous pamphlet entitled Common Sense that encouraged and demanded a separation from Great Britain. Common Sense would become the most widely read piece of literature during the time, and while the ideas written by Paine were inflammatory, they were not new to many Americans. By April, rumblings of independence had reached colonial legislatures. Both North Carolina and Virginia had passed resolutions in favor of independence. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee from Virginia officially proposed American independence to the Continental Congress. A group of men were then appointed to draft and propose a Declaration of Independence. Known as the Committee of Five, the men were as follows: Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was the youngest member of the Congress and would be the main writer of the Declaration. After about 2 weeks, Jefferson presented the other members of the committee a draft of his declaration. A few alterations were made, and the committee presented the first draft to Congress on June 28th. Naturally, a debate ensued over the language of the document. South Carolina, Georgia, and a few delegates from the other colonies refused to approve the first draft. It is incredibly interesting to know why, though, and this bit of history is often overlooked. Those delegates' adamant refusal was because of an anti-slavery clause written by Jefferson in the first draft of his Declaration, which means, by association, that Franklin, Adams, Sherman, and Livingston approved of the clause because they did not edit it out before their presentation. The anti-slavery clause was as follows, quote, "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished to die. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms against us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, by murdering the people for whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes against the liberties of one people with crimes he urges them to commit against the lives of the other." Much of what Jefferson wrote was an attack on the slave trade more than anything, and when he said, quote, "He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us," he was referring to the policy the King and Parliament had installed that would grant American slaves freedom if they took up arms against the Patriots. Moving on, Jefferson and the committee were then forced to remove that section from the Declaration. They agreed, but for the rest of his life, Thomas Jefferson believed that his Declaration of Independence had been mutilated by Congress in the final days. In fact, in John Adams' memoirs, he said, "I was delighted with the draft's high tone, especially that concerning Negro slavery, though I knew his Southern brethren would never suffer to let it pass. Congress cut it, as I suspected, but they obliterated some of the best of it." Those are strong words, and Adams finished on the topic by writing, "I have long wondered, had the original draft been published, what might have been." That is enough what-if propositions, though, because as July began in 1776, time was short, and Congress needed to act before unity was disrupted by a British attack. So another draft was proposed that was approved by Congress on July 2nd. On July 4th, 1776, the document was signed by the delegates present and sent off to the printers. Back to the business of war. The Continental Army's morale was actually quite high as August of 1776 began. They were desperately low on supplies, but the reading of the Declaration of Independence had inspired the Patriot Army. The mood would not last for long, though, because William Howe and his newly reinforced British Army sailed for New York. In late August, Howe landed over 20,000 soldiers on Long Island, and Washington and his army were not ready for such an attack. The American forces were separated between Manhattan Island and Long Island when the battle broke out. The disunity and poor generalship of Washington during the Battle of Long Island resulted in a massive, decisive victory for Howe and Great Britain. The Battle of Long Island proved to be the largest battle of the entire war and severely limited the abilities and confidence of the Continental Army afterwards. The Americans proceeded to retreat to Brooklyn Heights, where Howe neglected to attack despite the perilous position the Americans were in. During the night, Washington ordered a withdrawal across the East River, and again Howe was indecisive. The war easily could have been over in August of 76, but the British failure to continue their attack removed Washington from that danger. A standoff ensued as the two forces poised themselves for more conflict, but were interrupted by peace talks around September 11th. Peace could not be made, though, because the Americans refused to withdraw their Declaration of Independence. On September 15th, Howe marched into New York City with no contest, as the Americans pulled back again, this time to Harlem Heights. Howe took to the pursuit, but Washington and one of his up-and-coming commanders named Nathaniel Greene defeated the assault. Washington then began to creep his army northward some ways over the next month while trying to avoid losses. Nevertheless, things went from bad to worse for the Americans in late October and early November. The Americans suffered a small defeat at White Plains, New York, and weeks later received a crippling blow at Fort Washington. Howe seized Fort Washington with little casualties and captured over 3,000 Patriots. Scrambling to escape, Washington withdrew the Continental Army across the Hudson River, and in full retreat marched south into New Jersey. General Howe then split his army into three parts. He sent General Cornwallis to chase Washington into New Jersey, sent Henry Clinton to take Newport, Rhode Island, and he himself remained in New York City with a sizable force. Cornwallis captured Fort Lee in late November, and on the 8th of December, Clinton took Newport without opposition. All eyes were then centered on the military chase in New Jersey. Washington narrowly avoided battle several times and finally moved into Pennsylvania by crossing the Delaware River in mid-December. As winter descended on America, Cornwallis halted his chase for a moment and waited for General Howe's advice. The Americans took a breath, and the Patriot cause was on the ropes. For the past 4 months, the Patriot cause had eaten punch after punch from New York to Rhode Island to Quebec to New Jersey. Thomas Paine published another pamphlet called The American Crisis that best describes the situation. Quote, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot shrink from the service of his country, but tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered." The Continental Army was being held together by a shoestring at this point, but Washington decided not to winter his army, but to counterattack. The legendary tale of the Battle of Trenton begins on Christmas night, 1776. Near midnight, Washington led his army back across the Delaware River, but much of the river was already covered in ice. Washington estimated that it took approximately 3 hours for his forces to navigate the ice, and under the cover of night, his army approached Trenton, New Jersey, where almost 1,500 Hessian troops were either asleep or still celebrating Christmas. The Hessians were absolutely flabbergasted, and Washington captured over 1,000 of the mercenaries with single-digit casualty numbers. Get this though, at the Battle of Trenton, several Hall of Fame Americans led the multi-pronged surprise attack. There was obviously Washington, but also among the body were 2 other future presidents, James Madison and James Monroe. That's not all. John Marshall, future Chief Justice, and Aaron Burr were also present. Lastly, Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, and the man on your $10 bills, led the artillery detachment. Thus the Americans under Washington saved the year 1776, which had otherwise been a disastrous year of warfare. When Cornwallis learned of Trenton, he attempted to meet the Americans in battle, but was outflanked by Washington, and on January 3rd the Patriots scored another victory at the Battle of Princeton, before withdrawing back to safety. Both armies then pulled back and camped for the winter, with the British in New York City and the Americans in Morristown, New Jersey. Some interesting developments occur at this point in other theaters of the war. The British began preparations in Canada for an assault down towards Fort Ticonderoga in New England. The War Department in England had also managed to incite more fighting and unrest in the southern colonies. I've already mentioned the offer of freedom given to slaves if they rose up in arms, but the English had also convinced the Cherokee tribe located in Georgia and South Carolina to begin fighting in the South. The Cherokee were given promises of keeping their homeland, but without a British army to back them up in the South, they were driven away into the mountains by the Southern Patriots. Meanwhile, the hostilities were halted for several months due primarily to weather. Keep in mind that throughout much of history, warfare was almost entirely conducted in the summer and fall, depending on the geography and terrain of the location. In the colonies at this point, it was almost impossible to move in the winter because of the harsh weather and poor supplies. That's not to say it was impossible, just highly unlikely. In the spring it wasn't much better because the weather was sporadic and the ground was often drenched, making travel still difficult. So throughout the War of Independence, battles were rarely fought between January and May. That being the case, hostilities resumed in late June 1777. Before I dig into the campaigns of 1777, there were several new alliances developing. America and Britain had been trying to gather support for their war efforts. America had been in talks with France throughout the spring, trying to secure an alliance, and Great Britain convinced the Iroquois Confederation of Native American tribes to fight alongside the British Canadian Army. France had yet to agree to an official military alliance, but they did do 2 things. They increased the amount of supplies being sent to the Continental Army. This was being paid for, by the way, through loans given mostly by France itself. And they also began sending French officers to America, including Marquis de Lafayette, who joined Washington's staff in July. Continuing on, the British were trying to coordinate their efforts. The British strategy becomes rather confusing at this point because of a power struggle of sorts. In England, King George III and his ministry tried to plan and micromanage their American war, but in the colonies, the man with the final say was General Howe. That would work fine if they were all on the same page, but they weren't. The leaders of Great Britain wanted Howe's army to march north to Albany, New York, and converge with the Quebec army led by General Burgoyne that would march south. Howe approved of the idea of having the British Canadian Army march south, but he had no intention of marching north, for Howe wanted to take Philadelphia to the south. The ministry in Britain didn't mind the idea, but told Howe to expedite such a campaign in case General Burgoyne needed assistance in New York. So the British plan of action was to march their Quebec forces under General Burgoyne down into New York with assistance from the Iroquois tribes to recapture Fort Ticonderoga in the Hudson River Valley, as Howe marched to capture Philadelphia. Some sort of miscommunication or power struggle occurred, and Howe decided to move his force not across New Jersey to Philadelphia, but by sea by coming up through the Chesapeake Bay and landing in northern Maryland. This is a really odd choice that goes against the art of war, and it would hurt the British efforts in 1777. Let's analyze the tactic in depth because it is a great case study of everything wrong with how Great Britain was conducting their war effort. First, the lack of a complete commander-in-chief caused poor planning. Second, the British were overstretching themselves by leaving garrisons in New York, Newport, and Montreal while simultaneously marching south through tough New York terrain and crossing by sea into Maryland with another army. Third, Howe is making a massive tactical mistake by going by sea through the Chesapeake Bay. Going by sea isn't the problem. After all, the Royal Navy is second to none, and the Americans have no real navy to speak of at this point. The problem is in Howe's decision to land in Chesapeake Bay. By doing so, he would allow Washington the opportunity to sever his supply lines, slow communications, and be unable to march north to assist Burgoyne because his enemy is in the way. So let's see how this works out for the British. The Americans in both Morristown and Upper New York prepared for the oncoming offensives. Burgoyne's army arrived and captured Fort Ticonderoga with little resistance in July. This campaign is now known as the Saratoga Campaign, and the British immediately pursued the retreating Americans. As the Americans in New York moved south, they conducted guerrilla warfare, reportedly cutting down trees and disguising paths, and eliminating the foraging abilities of the approaching British. This slowed Burgoyne's march, and it began to grind to a halt as the terrain got worse and worse. Finally, Burgoyne sent a detachment of his 9,000 or so force to raid for supplies. The Americans under a General John Stark pounced, and the Battle of Bennington ensued that the Americans won decisively by quickly surrounding the 1,000 or so unprepared British soldiers. Soon after, several skirmishes broke out west of Fort Ticonderoga near modern-day Syracuse, New York. General Burgoyne's force was now faced with a decision: continue the campaign south and hope to defeat the Americans, stay and starve in Fort Ticonderoga, or retreat back to Quebec. Burgoyne decided to march his 6,000 to 7,000 man force south towards Albany. The American army in New York was now led by General Horatio Gates on paper, but in reality it was commanded by General Benedict Arnold in the field. The two armies began maneuvering themselves for better tactical position, but as every day ticked by, more British deserted Burgoyne and more backcountrymen joined the Patriots. Conflict finally began, and what followed was the pivotal Battle of Saratoga. The quote-unquote battle was actually several conflicts that took over about a month. The first was the Battle of Freeman's Farm that resulted in an American victory as Burgoyne lost over 600 of his already depleted army. A lot of off-the-battlefield stuff begins to happen now. In the American camp, General Gates and General Arnold reportedly get into a screaming match after Gates intentionally neglected to mention Arnold in his report to Congress, and after Gates changed the command structure of Arnold's troops. Arnold demanded to be transferred to Washington, but decided to stay after, according to Richard Ketchum, all of the line officers asked him to stay. That was how good of a commander Benedict Arnold was. In the British camp, things began to quicken as well, for reports came to New York of the desperate state of Burgoyne's force, and British General Henry Clinton immediately began to march a 3,000-man relief force north from the British New York City garrison. Time was crucial in how the Saratoga campaign would play out. The Americans now desired greatly to defeat Burgoyne in the field before the arrival of Clinton from the south. The problem for the British was that Burgoyne didn't know Clinton was coming, but the Patriots did. On October 7th, Burgoyne launched a force of 1,700 men against the American left. Presumably trying to flank the Americans before battle started, the American army had now swelled to a rabble of some 12,000 men, and Gates decided to send only a small detachment out to spurn the British flanking maneuver. Benedict Arnold decided this wasn't enough and gave his own orders, launching a sizable force against the attack. The Battle of Bemis Heights began, and while General Gates was furious, Arnold's decision proved highly effective as the Americans began to decimate Burgoyne's force. Soon the British retreated back to their own lines, and General Arnold rode down to the American positions and personally ordered and led the counteroffensive against the British lines. The battle continued on through the day, and during the fighting, Arnold was gravely wounded with a broken leg, but the Americans won a decisive victory and forced the British into a full retreat. The wife of a German officer named Baroness Frederica Riedesel was there and wrote of the Second Battle of Saratoga, saying, "My children lay on the floor with their heads in my lap, and thus we spent the whole night. The horrible smell in the cellar, the weeping of the children, and my fear prevented me from closing my eyes. 11 cannonballs flew through the house, and we could hear them rolling above. One of the poor soldiers who lay on the table and was just about to have his leg amputated had the other leg shot off by one of these balls." Burgoyne ordered a full retreat back north, but supplies and conditions were horrible. The Baroness also added, quote, "The greatest misery and extreme disorder prevailed in the army. The commissary had forgotten to distribute the food supplies. More than 30 officers came to me because they could not stand the hunger no longer." End quote. The situation was dire, but the Baroness was mistaken. The commissary did not forget. They simply did not have anything left. The Americans surrounded what was left of Burgoyne's army on October 17th, and the British surrendered to General Gates. If you're wondering, the Baroness and her family survived, so don't worry. Hearing of the surrender, General Clinton to the south turned back to New York City, and the Battle of Saratoga had been decisively won by the Americans. Meanwhile, Washington and Howe had been exchanging blows around Philadelphia. When Howe landed his army of some 15,000 in Maryland, Washington placed his Continental Army in the way. After a few weeks of feints and movements, Washington was once again outmaneuvered, and Howe soundly defeated the Americans at the Battle of the Brandywine. Soon after, Washington decided to save his army and gave word for Congress to escape the city. On September 26th, Howe captured Philadelphia without contest, and Washington repositioned and attacked a section of Howe's army at the Battle of Germantown, outside Philadelphia, but was once again repulsed and defeated. Washington and his army moved across the Delaware River again and shadowed Howe's movements. Morale was low, but brought up by the reports of the victory at Saratoga. Several small skirmishes followed in November and December, but both armies began preparations for winter. Howe would stay in Philadelphia, and Washington decided to winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, 20 miles outside the city. What came next was one of the most infamous winters in American history, and I could probably do an entire podcast on Valley Forge and the conditions the Continental Army suffered. Suffice it to say, I don't want to slow down the pace of the story, and honestly, the numbers and the words of those who experienced it speak for themselves. The Americans under Washington were in a desperate state. Food was short, proper clothing was near non-existent, disease was rampant, and the snow wouldn't stop falling. On Christmas Day, 1777, a French officer named Johann de Kalb said, "It is very uncertain that half the army is almost naked, in a great measure barefooted." Washington agreed when writing to his quartermaster in Congress on numerous occasions begging for shoes, jackets, and leather for his men. The clothing crisis would continue throughout the winter at Valley Forge, and disease began to spread rapidly. Smallpox took hundreds of lives in the American camp, and horses dropped dead or were sent away. By the time the Continental Army left Valley Forge in late spring, over 2,500 soldiers had died from various causes. The most common were smallpox, starvation, and hypothermia. The winter of Valley Forge was a frozen hell that is truly impossible to put in perspective without having experienced such conditions. Yet not all was lost for Washington and the American hope for victory. In February, France was finally convinced by Ambassador Benjamin Franklin to agree to a full-scale war alliance with the United States. On top of that, King George and his War Department decided on a change of leadership. They replaced William Howe with Sir Henry Clinton, and soon after, Clinton ordered the British forces in Philadelphia to return to New York City, for fear of a combined Franco-American attack on New York. Clinton then decided to try and spread the Americans out, and Great Britain also expanded the war to the Caribbean. Britain began to attack the French West Indies, primarily to prevent the French Navy from being able to concentrate solely on helping the Americans in the North American theater. Conflict also broke out near Gibraltar and in India as Franco-English hostilities reignited. In America, though, Henry Clinton knew it would be hard to take Washington out because of how uncanny the Patriots had become at retreating and avoiding ultimate defeat. So in order to bleed the colonies and suck away troops from the northern colonies, Clinton authorized an assault on Savannah, Georgia. But due to the growth of the war and the complicated logistics of such an attack, the British had to wait until almost 1779 to launch the attack. So most of the fighting of 1778 actually took place in the west, with several skirmishes in Ohio and Illinois country. The only major violence in 78 in North America came on December 29th, when finally the British captured Savannah. The year 1778 was important not because of the battles that happened, or didn't happen, but because of the expansion of the war. The American War of Independence was getting too large for Great Britain to properly handle. They were now having to manage armies in New York, Georgia, England, the West Indies, and India, while trying to maintain naval superiority throughout the globe. The war was now burning through money fast, and British popular support for the war was now beginning to wane. It was becoming clear that there was a time limit to how long Great Britain could truly stay in the conflict. This became even more apparent as 1779 began, when in June, Spain entered the war allied with America and France. Spain's role in the war was far less significant than France's, but it was a signal nonetheless that Britain was sliding towards defeat. Also significant to note as 1779 began was the rising strength of the newly formed Continental Navy. Until France entered as an official ally in 78, America's Navy had been little more than contracted privateers. There was no fleet to really speak of, but America had many capable sailors that could go toe-to-toe with the sailors of the Royal Navy. So what these Patriot sailors needed was ships, and when France entered into the fray, they were able to spare a few ships to the Americans. A splendid example of this is when the legendary American captain John Paul Jones was given a 42-gun French vessel and a squadron of smaller ships to command. He renamed his vessel the Bonhomme Richard and proceeded to absolutely harass the Royal Navy in 79. Captain Jones became so daring that he came into conflict with the Royal Navy only miles off the west coast of southern England. During the naval battle, Jones and his Bonhomme Richard took out 2 British vessels, including a 50-gun man-of-war. American naval warfare was still limited, but actions like John Paul Jones's were seen as inspiration to the many patriots back in the colonies. In the American South, the small British army numbered at some 3,000 to 4,000 men and proceeded to march up the coast towards Charleston, South Carolina. As they approached the city, the British army swelled to 10,000 as Loyalists joined their ranks, and soon the siege of Charleston began in April of 1780. The Patriot Southern Army was untrained and small and gave no significant resistance to the British and surrendered the city in May. Taking cities, though, meant nothing in the long run because it seemed like wherever the British went, resistance disappeared, and when they left, it cropped right back up again. A British commander spoke of this very same thing, saying, quote, "Whenever the rebel army is said to have been cut to pieces, it would be more consonant with the truth to say that it may have been dispersed, determined to join again. In the meantime, they take oaths of allegiance and live comfortably among us, to drain us of our moneys, get acquainted with our numbers, and learn our intentions." End quote. General Cornwallis now took over British operations in the American South. Soon after August 1780, Cornwallis routed what was left of the Southern Patriot Army led by General Gates, who had come down to take command after Saratoga. After much arguing and pleading, General Washington was convinced to finally send one of his veteran commanders to lead the Southern Patriot Army against Cornwallis. He chose Nathaniel Greene, who took command in December of 1780. Before I move on with the rapidly developing Southern theater, much was still happening elsewhere in the colonies that I have to catch up with. As 79 wound down, Washington had moved his army north of New York City to better harass Clinton and his forces there. The Hudson River Valley became home to a series of small skirmishes as Clinton and Washington wrestled for strategic position. General Clinton was becoming pressured for a decisive victory by King George and Lord North, but it was becoming more and more unlikely. A plot was concocted between Clinton's spy network and Benedict Arnold during this time that would have gave the British control of the Hudson Valley all the way up to West Point, but Arnold's treason was revealed and the plot was foiled. After this and Cornwallis' success in the Carolinas, Clinton reluctantly placed most of his focus and efforts into the British Southern Campaign. Clinton would hold New York City with a sizable force until the end of the war, but he now put the hope of victory with Cornwallis in the South. During this time, Washington repositioned back in New Jersey, and sent Marquis de Lafayette to France in request of a substantial French land force. The Northern Theater was then quiet until July of 1780 when Lafayette and the French Navy arrived in force and recaptured Newport, Rhode Island. The French brought with them supplies, a substantial naval fleet, and a 5,000-man army under Comte de Rochambeau. I probably pronounced it incorrectly, and I apologize, but anyways, thus as Washington dispatched General Greene, all eyes were on the American South. Nathaniel Greene assumed command of the Southern Patriot Army at Hillsborough, North Carolina, in December. Shortly after arrival, Greene began to reorganize his army. He based his strategy on accomplishing his chief objective. This objective was to delay Cornwallis and hamper the British march north. To accomplish this goal, Greene split his army amongst a trusted group of commanders. The strategy thereafter was never to engage in direct battle with Cornwallis' main army, and to only attack in smaller sections of the British march. Also, if found in a losing position, the Patriot forces were always encouraged to retreat from battle. This is known as a tactical retreat, and would be heavily employed by the Americans. With the strategy clear and winter weather passable, several American detachments entered into South Carolina as 1781 began. Cornwallis miscalculated and had the main body of his army prepare and go after the one force led by General Greene himself. This left a 900 to 1,200 body of British soldiers open in northern South Carolina, and another American contingency, approximately 1,800 strong, pounced on the small British force on January 17th at the Battle of Cowpens. The Americans forced a quick and decisive victory at Cowpens and immediately began a full retreat north to escape Cornwallis' grasp. The The two small American armies linked up in North Carolina, and with General Greene at the helm, the Patriots hightailed it across all of North Carolina. It was only after the Americans fled across the Dan River into Virginia that Cornwallis finally turned back. But General Greene had sent word ahead to Virginia and was greeted with reinforcements. After only a few days, Greene now went on the offensive, chasing Cornwallis with his re-energized army. After only a few weeks, the two armies met in the field in March of 1781 at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Greene retreated from battle, giving the victory to the British, but Cornwallis lost a quarter of his army in the process. The battle changed the British strategy entirely because Greene and the Patriots seemingly received reinforcements daily, but the British under Cornwallis had no such opportunity to replace lost troops. So despite Cornwallis's many victories, he had to retreat and move his army to the coast. When Cornwallis moved his army to Wilmington, North Carolina, he ceded the interior of both Carolinas to Greene and the Patriots. In late April, Cornwallis decided to march his small army north into Virginia. This was against the orders of Sir Henry Clinton, but I'll cut Cornwallis slack because if you read Clinton's letters, they appear very scatterbrained and confused. Everything appeared to be converging on Virginia. Congress had feared the British attack in Virginia and had dispatched a 1,200-man army led by Marquis de Lafayette to Yorktown earlier in March. Several small battles occurred in Virginia as summer approached, and Clinton sent orders to Cornwallis to fortify a port city near the Chesapeake Bay. Clinton and Cornwallis's plan to fortify Virginian port was done in order to give Cornwallis the means of attaining more supplies and more troops. In June, such an idea seemed reasonable, even wise, because Washington and Rochambeau were in New York, Greene was in South Carolina, Lafayette was outnumbered and pushed inland by Cornwallis, and the French Navy was currently conducting operations in the Caribbean. That was the British plan to end 1781, and the Franco-American leaders now began concocting their own plan of attack. Everything begins to happen very rapidly now in the summer of 1781. Washington and Rochambeau joined forces about 30 miles outside New York City in White Plains and deliberated about what to do to counteract the British movements. Washington argued for a combined attack on New York, but Rochambeau strongly proposed a combined effort in Virginia. They could not come to an agreement, but they did agree to leave the decision to the leader of the French fleet, Admiral Comte de Grasse. In July, de Grasse received the correspondence from Washington and decided on the attack in Virginia. He told them he would arrive in Chesapeake Bay in late August and would be bringing 3,500 French Marines with him. Cornwallis had inspected several ports and decided on Yorktown, and in New York, Washington at last consented to the attack in Virginia, and he and Rochambeau began to march south at a rapid pace in mid-August. The Franco-American army gave two feints towards New York City to divert Clinton's attention, and then they set on their way. Washington sent word to Nathaniel Greene to hurry to Virginia and sent instructions to Lafayette to do everything he could do to prevent Cornwallis from leaving Yorktown. The descent towards Virginia began. All French and American forces were sprinting towards Yorktown from north, south, west by land, and by sea from the east. In New York, Clinton finally realized what was happening and in late August sent 19 ships of the line with 4,000 men with a letter of warning to Cornwallis. But Admiral de Grasse arrived in Chesapeake Bay first on August 30th. The French disembarked their 3,500 Marines with orders to join Lafayette. The British fleet from New York arrived in the Chesapeake on September 5th, and the massive naval battle of Chesapeake Bay broke out between the French and English fleets. After 3 hours of fighting on the evening of September 5th, de Grasse and the French fleet won the day. The Chesapeake Bay was now under French control, and Cornwallis was now unable to receive reinforcements. Washington, Rochambeau, and Greene all arrived in Lafayette's camp by mid-September, and the siege of Yorktown commenced on September 28th. The French and American combined bombardment from both land and sea began in earnest and continued around the clock. An American artilleryman named Edward Elley described the situation by saying, "In this battery 4 24-pounders, 4 16-pounders, 4 12-pounders, and 12 mortar pieces, and these were fired in platoons, 4 at a time, and the mortars 3 at a time, in order to keep up a constant fire. And whilst engaged in firing the guns, it appeared to me as if the earth would sink beneath us." The shelling continued into October, and the British resolve began to weaken rapidly. Sarah Osborne, husband to an American soldier, was there on the fateful day of October 17th, when Cornwallis and the British finally relented. She said, "They dug the entrenchments nearer and nearer to Yorktown every night or two till the last. The enemy fired heavy till about 9 o'clock next morning, then stopped, and the drums from the enemy beat excessively. The drums continued beating, and all at once the officers hurrahed and swung their hats, and I asked them, 'What is the matter now?' Then they replied, 'The British have surrendered.'" End quote. So it was that the climax of the war ended with Cornwallis' surrender of his 8,000 men at the Siege of Yorktown in October of 1781. When word of the decisive Franco-American victory reached Great Britain, Prime Minister Lord North screamed in distress and is said to have mumbled over and over to himself, quote, "Oh God, it's all over." Indeed, he spoke the truth. Lord North and much of his cabinet resigned soon after. General Clinton was recalled to London, and all offensive measures were suspended in North America. Peace negotiations began in 1782, and the American War of Independence was brought to a close with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The United States of America was now a legitimate, independent country, and the American Revolution was complete. Remember to rate and review on iTunes, and come back next episode for the beginning of the French Revolution.
Thank you, and good night.